Have you ever heard some scientists say that if God really created us, He should have done a better job? Or humans and animals could have been designed with much better features? Evolutionary biologists have picked up a really bad habit of making statements like these and then using them to make arguments to explain evolution. Coming up next, Dr. Seuss Biology with Dr. Paul Nelson. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Origins. My name's Donn Chapman, and it's my privilege to be your host. You know, Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science and we use it to validate the truth of creation. We do that by interviewing members of the scientific community who also believe that God's our creator, and I'm really got to tell you, I'm pumped about our show today. We have Dr. Paul Nelson with us. Dr. Nelson, how good to have you with us.
It's really a treat. Thank you for inviting me.
I've been looking at some of your stuff, and I'm just so excited for our folks to know what God has taught you to share. You're a member of the Discovery Institute in Seattle, and you also teach at Biola, and you live in Chicago.
Right. So I spend a lot of time on airplanes.
And your wife spends all your frequent flyer miles.
Yes. When they get to be enough for an award, we go somewhere nice.
Now, we're going to talk today about Dr. Seuss to get us started. Dr. Seuss,
yeah.
Biology. Help us with that.
Well, Dr. Seuss Biology is a kind of lighthearted name for really what amounts to a pretty serious problem. And that is that evolutionary biologists, I would say since the time of Darwin, have picked up a bad habit. And in the Dr. Seuss sense, I'm referring particularly to a book I loved as a child, If I Ran the Zoo. Now, it makes a wonderful children's story, but it doesn't make for good biology. The real problem with Dr. Seuss Biology is assuming that you know how to make animals better than they actually are. And then using that argument to say, well, that shows that they evolved, because if I can imagine a way to make them better, then surely God could have done that, or an intelligent designer could have done a better job. So in this program, we're going to look at some of these arguments and evaluate them carefully in terms of their evidential basis.
I don't want to jump ahead of you, but it takes a pretty big ego to assume you could have done a better job than God.
Oh, I tell you something, we don't even really know how proteins fold, single proteins. So to say that you could build a better panda, we'll talk about that, or a better airway for human beings, takes some hubris, I guess.
Well, give us some examples. Go ahead.
Well, have you ever choked on something?
Yeah, I'm guilty of liking steak so much that I probably don't chew enough before I swallow it.
Well, I've choked on things. It's scary.
Yes.
Do something for me. Put your fingertip on your Adam's apple and swallow. Kind of uncomfortable.
Yes.
But you feel a lot of motion there.
A lot of things happening.
Yeah, there's a complex system of cartilage and muscles that's doing an important job. I'll show you up at the board.
Okay, I appreciate that.
When we swallow, we're not conscious of it most of the time, but right in here, there's an important structure called the epiglottis. And what that does is, as we're taking in food or water or swallowing something, it closes over the top of our airway. Our airway is in front, our esophagus is behind it. So the epiglottis is, helping this merging lane here function properly so that when we swallow food or water, it doesn't go into our lungs.
Right.
Occasionally, however, this malfunctions. In 1999, in the suburb of Chicago where I live, a 12-year-old girl named Casey Fish was playing a game that's very unwise called Chubby Bunny, where you put marshmallows in your mouth and try to say the phrase Chubby Bunny. She was laughing, she inhaled, and a marshmallow lodged right there. By the time they got her to the hospital, she was dead. She'd be in her, mid-20s now. It's a tragic story. So this kind of design raises questions for many evolutionary biologists. They say, why would God have done it that way? Why is there that merging lane there that runs the risk of choking? And they say, I could have done a better job. These arguments are quite ancient. In fact, you can go back before Christ and find them in ancient literature. Lucretius was a Roman poet, a follower of the Greek atomists, and in his classic poem on the nature of things, philosophical poem, he said, I can show you that this world was not made by God. Too much is wrong with it. Now these arguments come into the present. Well, first, let me show you how they work. In the atheistic version, you begin with an idea of God, here illustrated as a geometer building the universe. Then you say, well, if God's like that, if God's an optimizing, benevolent creator, then the world should look a certain way. But, an evolutionary biologist might say, it doesn't look the way we expect it to, therefore, God doesn't exist. Now, that's the atheistic version of the argument. That form of argument, I call it a species here on the slide, comes into evolution by way of the Enlightenment. So Darwin, as a young man, not young here, but at the time he was doing his most creative work, he was reading David Hume,
Yes.
and the other Enlightenment figures, but they took their inspiration from these ancient Greek philosophers. So you see there's an intellectual lineage here coming right up to Darwin. But Darwin does something very subtle and very powerful. Instead of making the atheistic argument, you know, the one I showed just a moment ago, that God doesn't exist, Darwin does something that's really much trickier. What he says is, okay, let's start with a particular conception of God, and if the world doesn't fit with that, then God must have acted in a way different than we expected. He didn't create things directly, but rather he used natural laws to build.
So Darwin wasn't necessarily atheistic.
No, in fact, it's hard to say that Darwin at any point in his life was an atheist. When he set sail on the Beagle, he was really a Bible-believing Christian,
Right.
at least by all exterior signs, and gradually lost his faith over a long period of time, and was very careful not to argue directly for atheism in his writings. This argument is not an atheist argument.
No, it's not.
Yeah, it's saying...
It begins with God.
It begins with God. In fact, you need a model of God to make the argument work.
So he kind of blames the process more than he blames God.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, here's a cartoon version of what's going on. We've got a nice chocolate eclair here and a carrot, and God in his sort of white beard form is putting 2 calories in the carrot and 12.50 in the eclair. And I can tell you, Chicago is well supplied with first-rate bakeries.
Yes.
There are many mornings I'm walking by, I wish the signs were switched.
Yeah.
They're not. So that's a cartoon explanation, but these arguments actually play an important role in evolutionary theory. So when I was a graduate student, for instance, I used this book. This is a technical monograph published by Oxford that you'd use in a graduate course, written by George Williams, who was one of the leading evolutionary biologists of the 20th century. So you'd see a book like that, you think there's going to be no theology in there. In fact, when you look at the book, Williams says, we're plagued with these design flaws. He mentions several. One that he focuses on is choking. Why do we choke if we're designed by an optimizing creator? Stephen Gould, with whom I interacted a little bit as a student, made a famous formulation of this argument where he used the panda's thumb. I'll come to that in just a moment, but what Gould said is this principle of imperfection was Darwin's most common guide. Gould calls it the panda principle because of his favorite example, the giant panda. He said, we've got these structures that we see in nature, and they look kind of like kludges. Not good design. Why would God have done it that way? So here's the panda, beautiful, entertaining creature. If you look right here, the panda is gripping bamboo in its forelimbs in a way that's really remarkable when you examine the details. This is the panda's forelimb, and you can count the digits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those correspond to R5. But over here is a kind of structure that looks very much like a thumb. It's called actually a pseudothumb. In us, this bone corresponds to the radial sesamoid, which is a bone in our wrist. But the panda's radial sesamoid is very well developed, and there's a hairless groove here that the panda uses to hold the bamboo. Now, Gould looks at this and he says, gee, that's dumb. That's not as elegant as our thumb. Here's how he actually puts it. He says, this proves evolution. Odd arrangements and funny solutions, like the panda's thumb, are the proof of evolution. Now, that's a pretty strong claim, you know.
Yeah,
saying you've got proof.
In science is a pretty demonstrative term.
Right. He says, these are paths that a sensible God, interesting phrase, I wonder how he knows that, paths that a sensible God would never tread, but that a natural process constrained by history follows perforce. So the argument works this way. You've got an intelligent designer, and you give that cause some characteristics, and that designer should make optimal design. But Gould says we see apparently suboptimal design in nature. And why would that designer have made things like that, given our assumption about his or its character? He then says, well, look, evolution, it's a blind natural process, will give you suboptimal design. Natural selection, for instance, doesn't make animals as perfect as they can be, just good enough to get by. But every now and then, natural selection will also produce optimal design. So the argument in a nutshell is that evolution is a better explanation for both apparent optimality and apparent suboptimality. Ergo, that's not a good explanation. Now, that's the logic of the argument in a kind of a cartoon form. So that's how these arguments work. Now, there's a problem here. This argument makes some assumptions that we ought to look at skeptically. I'll give you one example. Douglas Futuyma is an evolutionary biologist who is very concerned to defend the theory against critics like me. And one of the examples he gives is blind cavefish. These are Mexican tetras. They're quite remarkable. For instance, they've lost most of their pigment. Yes. They're living in total darkness, so they don't need it to protect them from UV light. But what's most interesting is they have here what appears to be a little tiny bit of an eye. It doesn't actually function as an eye. There's enough there that you could see that it used to be an eye. So Futuyma says, you know, why would a designer do that? Give a non-functional eye to a fish like this? Is this wise design? Now, what is he assuming? Well, he's assuming that there's been no change in the history of this species. Let's take that same cavefish, however, and ask two defenders of intelligent design what they think. So you can take the same creature and put it in front of Wayne Frere and Percival Davis, two biologists who advocate intelligent design. Looking at this same species, they say what's happened is pretty clear. The ancestors of these fish were isolated in a cave, and in a cave environment where it's totally black, an eye is actually a bad thing to have because it can be a site for injury. And you have to put energy into building it. If you don't need it, you can get rid of it, in the sense that mutations to that structure that would normally be selected out of a population are tolerated. The fish gets along just fine, and in fact, it's still interfertile with its ancestors outside the cave that have eyes. So what you see here is a richer, more subtle understanding of creation or design, where something modifies its form with the passage of time.
God built adaptability into the fish.
Yes.
And when something has potential for danger, but it's not needed in that environment, then God just lets it kind of devolve.
You can lose information.
Yes.
Insects on islands often lose their wings. Wow. Because if there's no predators around, they don't need them. Insects in caves often lose pigment because they don't need it to protect them from UV light. So it's possible to lose information. The bottom line is, if you give a theory of design or a theory of creation all the explanatory resources that it can properly use, it can handle a puzzle like this quite readily. In fact, can predict something like blind cavefish.
That's a tremendous illustration, and it really helps. We have to go to a break right now. When we come back, Dr. Nelson has a story from about airplanes that I don't want you to miss, so don't go away. We'll be right back.
Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Paul A. Nelson, Ph.D., is a philosopher of biology and evolutionary theory. Dr. Nelson is currently a fellow of the Discovery Institute and adjunct professor in science and religion at Biola University. Paul lectures frequently regarding the intelligent design debate at colleges and universities throughout the U.S. and Europe. He has appeared in several films on intelligent design for Illustra Media. One video he would like to make available is titled Metamorphosis. To order the DVD, call 800-266-7741. To contact Dr. Nelson, write to Biola University, 13800 Biola Avenue, La Mirada, California, 90639.
We are back with Dr. Nelson, and you have for us a great example from the field of aviation. I'm anxious for our people to hear this.
Well, let me tell you the moral first. Most people think that it's easy to say what's optimal and not, suboptimal, and it's not. Let me give you an example from military aircraft that's really quite surprising. This is a case where the contractors, Lockheed and Convair, actually told the government, don't send us any more money. Now, it's pretty unusual to tell the government, I can't take your checks anymore.
It really is.
They requested that these contracts be canceled. The question is why. Now, here is one of the planes. They were trying to build a vertical takeoff and landing craft, which in military terms is a great function to be able to perform. Going up and down right on the footprint of the aircraft. You don't need a long runway. So here it is. And it's plane standing on its tail. You can see how robust the tail is down there. This plane actually never landed in that configuration. And see if you can figure out why.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, I hope they don't have, this is going to sound a little bit prejudicial, but I hope they don't have a woman driving it. That's all I'm saying.
Look at the cockpit.
Yeah, parking parallels nothing compared to this. Yeah.
I mean, think about sitting as a pilot in that cockpit and you're trying to land the plane.
Really?
Unlike owls, we cannot rotate our head in 270 degrees. So a pilot in this plane would have a very hard time landing it. In fact, as I said, it never actually landed.
You would have a very hard time knowing how far you were to the ground coming down because you can't really see down there.
You can't see. You can't look out the back of your head.
Okay.
The problem was the landings, and they quickly discovered you could not even land the plane. In fact, they practiced landing on clouds. Look at the Harrier. Now, this is a workable vertical takeoff and landing design. If you look at the orientation of the cockpit, the pilot can look out and see the ground more or less, exactly as he needs to. The problem is that the plane that we saw previously, you can't do that. So they never actually landed it. Told the Navy, don't send us any more money. And the Navy agreed. That was the end of that plane. In fact, I took that example from a book called The World's Worst Aircraft, which is very amusing. Now, think about this from the perspective of determining optimality and suboptimality. That plane probably took 2 to 3 years to build. They start with an idea, vertical takeoff and landing. Then they say, well, we'll stand a plane on its tail, which is a natural thing to think about doing. Engineers design the plane, the machinists build it. Not until the test flight stage, when they're actually going to try to get the thing up and down, does anyone say, how are we going to land these planes? The moral of the story is it's not easy to determine what would be the best design or the worst design or something in the middle.
Until it's functioning.
Until it's actually functioning. And these are things that we make. We make airplanes. So when we go back to the Panda, the question you should ask is, how do you know that it's suboptimal? I actually had a conversation with Stephen Gould in his office at Harvard about this, and he said, Paul, just look at it. It's obviously not optimal. Well, I'll tell you what, in a bamboo stripping competition, between this thumb and that one, they'd win hands down, no pun intended. All right.
So the real problem that Gould was having was that he was looking at a human thumb and thinking this isn't as good, but we don't live where the panda lives.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the panda's using its forelimb in a very different way. So what I did is I said, I don't accept this judgment from Gould. I'm going to go to the natural history literature and look at what other people have said about the thumb. Turns out, almost everyone, in fact, I can't think of a single exception, among the observers of the giant panda, they said these creatures are remarkably dexterous. They can pick up little pieces of bamboo, hold sugar cane or a slice of bread, or grip a tin dish in its forelimb. They're probably the most dexterous carnivores on the planet. A female panda in China was observed to pick up single straws or little candy discs like a Necco wafer. And in fact, the Japanese team examined how that whole structure worked, and they determined that it worked with just amazing precision when all the pieces came together. So when I asked Gould one-on-one, what's the evidence, he didn't provide it. And what bothers me is when you look at the available evidence, it points completely in the opposite direction. Let's go back to the human airway. That's what we started with. What would be an obvious fix?
Well, to separate them so that they don't have a collision point there.
Right, you get rid of that merging line.
Yeah, that's right.
So here's a simple way to do it. You have the air come in through your nose, which is in fact, in normal conditions, most of the air you breathe comes in that way.
Right.
And then food and water this way, and the choke point is gone. Now, think about it. Does that create more problems than it solves?
It might if you need to breathe through your mouth.
Let's consider some of the problems with this so-called better arrangement. What if you get a cold?
Yeah.
All gets stuffed up there.
Then you have to
now
breathe.
you got to go to the ICU.
Right.
It's a life-threatening illness. You've lost your backup pathway. What if you're playing basketball or ice hockey, or you've got to run for a bus, and your O2 requirements go way up?
Yeah.
You got no extra pathway to get more air.
In fact, if you're a jogger or a runner or any kind of athlete, you do the majority of your breathing during those times through your mouth.
That's right. You see somebody,
That's right.
Yeah, busting to win a race, and
So
they're
there's no alternate source.
There's no alternate source. You've lost your backup pathway, which means your ability to respond to environmental demands has gone down.
Yeah.
How about what we're doing right now?
Talking.
And we're doing that with
Air that comes out through our mouths.
we articulate speech with our lips, teeth, tongue, and so forth.
So the overlap is absolutely essential to function, isn't it?
It's essential for a basic human, feature, speech.
Yeah.
Once we get rid of our air coming out of our mouth, I think the best we can do is probably honk. We're not going to have a conversation like this.
All right.
All right, so what's the bottom line? Dr. Seuss biology makes for fun stories. It doesn't make for good science. When someone hears an argument saying, I could have done a better job building whatever, the airway, the panda's thumb, the human eye, our back, and so forth, you need to be very cautious in accepting that argument as a statement of science. Claims about optimality and suboptimality need to be supported by evidence. If I told you that my Honda Odyssey is, better for getting a load of groceries home than an Indy car, we can evaluate that. If I told you that the Indy car is better for going around a track, we can evaluate that in terms of a benchmark and evidence. So be very cautious when someone gives you one of these arguments and ask for the evidence.
I just think this is an amazing, you've given us an amazing gift in this program. God's an incredible designer, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
And usually when we think there's a flaw, it's really that we don't have all the information. It isn't that God hasn't done a good job.
The flaw comes from our lack of understanding.
That's right.
And the deeper you dig into biology, when you examine everything that an organism needs to do and all the possibilities that could affect it, what looks to you like a bad design may turn out to be actually a very good design.
If you had a very passionate evolutionist sitting here in this chair instead of me, and they listened to what you just said, how would they answer that?
I think what they would say is give science more time.
Time is always a thing.
Well,
we just haven't done what we've done enough yet.
There comes a point, however, when the question you're putting to nature needs to change. And if you're not listening to what nature is telling you, if I can personify her, she talks back to us.
Yes.
And you need to listen to what she's saying, and if you haven't solved your problem, try something different.
Yeah. And intelligent design, is that something different?
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it opens up all kinds of new possibilities for understanding the nature of life.
Dr. Nelson, when I sit in this chair and I have guests like you, it makes me thank God that God made you and people like you with intelligence and with gifts and yet with a love for God that brings you. I know you're talking about intelligent design and I'm talking about God here, but obviously the conclusion comes that this is so complex. intelligent force with a plan and a design made it.
Right.
And I believe the more evidence we uncover, the one thing I always want our viewers to know is that we never have to be afraid of truth.
That's right.
And we can search anywhere. Truth's always where you find it. It can always stand on its own, and you can take it with you anywhere.
Amen.
You know, my friends, I think you'll find that this incredible designer who made us also loves us and wants to know us. And as you know him and know the glory of his creation better, you'll discover that it's God's view he created you. That should be your worldview too. Hope to see you again soon here on Origins. Until then, God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins, program number 1212, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.